Hello and welcome to this week's video. My name is Anuska Taylor. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, on today's video, I am talking about performance anxiety or stage fright. And in my experience, my own personal experience and my experience of working with thousands of people over the years, this is something that impacts everyone to a greater or lesser extent. And truthfully, if you are looking to up-level in your career or your business, you have to work with this because the more visible you become, the more public speaking you're going to have to do. And with success comes more visibility. So you do really have to learn to address this. You can't keep running away from it. And yes, a lot of the popular advice out there is around practicing and rehearsing and knowing your material and knowing your audience. Yes, that all matters. But from my perspective, there's something so much deeper going on. So yes, we still need to practice, but we really want to address what's going on underneath that. And that's what I want to talk about today. So if you're new to my channel, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button. And I release weekly videos on all things voice related, specifically around the speaking voice. But as a singer myself, and also I do still teach some singing, a lot of this will resonate with you as a singer as well, if you are more of a singer than a public speaker. So I hope you get enormous value from my videos. Please leave a comment, ask a question. And also if you've got any topics you want me to cover, also comment below with that too. So let's get going. So performance anxiety, oh goodness, is something I've had to work on over the years. And interestingly, I mean, I've been singing most of my life, and I found as I got older, the anxiety weirdly got worse. So as a child, I didn't really have any performance anxiety. And then when I started to get into my 20s, it started to get worse. And it's only really now, particularly with the Jungian psychology aspect of my work, a lot of my own inner work, that I have found more peace with it and I'm less bothered. And I've literally performed in front of thousands of people before. So I'm talking about this from years of experience. As I say, starting with not a lot of anxiety, and then in my 20s, I felt like it really peaked into something that I sort of described at times as sort of like an out-of-body experience. Like my body just kind of went into shock. So I really understand what it's like to feel that deep fear when you are in front of an audience. So first of all, why does it bring up so much fear? Because it's so common. And it's really what stops people, I believe, in going for their dreams, in going for bigger promotions, in allowing their business to grow, because they know consciously or unconsciously, this means I'm going to have to be more visible. I'm going to have to do more public speaking. And literally clients have said this to me before. It's like, I know if I take that leadership job, it's going to require me to now speak in front of bigger groups, bigger audiences. I'm going to be expected to go to industry events, do keynote speeches, etc. And that fills me with terror. So I'd rather stay in my lower job where I not as much as expected of me, even though there's a big part of me that wants more challenge in my career or your business as well. You know, often unconsciously we keep our business small so that we don't have to become more visible. From my perspective, at least, public speaking is so terrifying for most of us because it's really about a social death, or it's the fear of a social death. So from our ego's perspective, this is the chatter, the monkey mind, the part of us that's trying to keep us safe. And it's really the part of our mind that's giving us this sort of running commentary of our life. So its intentions are good. It wants to keep us safe. And it does a good job, because if you're still here and you're watching my video on YouTube, then you must have a roof over your head and some kind of device to watch it and an internet connection. So you are surviving, you know, on some level, you've ticked that survival box. So we want to go beyond survival though. And so for me, a lot of the advice given out there in the personal development world is really from a sort of survival-based approach. So when we are public speaking, we're really risking being criticized, being judged, being blamed, being hated, being cancelled, being abandoned, being unloved, being rejected. And let's be honest, none of us want any of that. I mean, we might have the bravado of, oh, I don't really care, but we do care. None of us really want to be ostracized and outed from the group. And whatever the group is, our family, our peers, our colleagues, our community, we all want to, on some level, fit in, be liked, and be accepted. So when we put ourselves in a public speaking situation, we are really exposing ourselves in a much, much bigger way. And whether you are doing this online, like what I'm doing with YouTube videos, or whether you're doing this in person, there is still that element of risk of exposure. And what will people think? Will I be rejected? Will I be abandoned? And from my perspective, I think our deepest fear is being abandoned. We sort of often think our deepest fear is death, but actually when you're dead, you're dead. I think our biggest fear is all of the lead up to death, and it's the abandonment, and it's the rejection, and it's the shame, and it's all of that stuff that we fear feeling in the lead up to potentially dying. So it's really so deeply ingrained in us, this fear, because from our ancestors' perspective, if you were sort of outed from the group, you would most certainly die. You know, you would not be able to survive in the wild. You might get eaten by a wild animal. You might starve to death. You might freeze to death. But you would find it very, very difficult to survive on your own from our ancestors' perspective. So this is very, very hardwired and deeply ingrained. So the first point I want to make is we don't want to make any of this wrong. So if you do feel a lot of anxiety or fear, that's all right. It's just a normal part of having a healthy mind. So really, really important, because as soon as we make something wrong, then we reject it and we resist it. And as Carl Jung said, what we resist persists. So it's not going to go anywhere. If anything, we're going to give it more and more energy, and it's just going to control us even more. Let's talk about the anxiety then on stage. Now, when I say stage, it doesn't have to be a literal stage. It could be a metaphorical stage. You know, you could be running a webinar, you could be running an online workshop, you could be on a podcast or an interview. You don't have to actually be physically standing on a stage, but you might be physically standing on a stage. From my perspective, this is really all about a loss of control. And this is why often the advice given is to prepare and rehearse, because we're trying to minimize our feeling of being out of control. So the more rehearsed I am, the more practiced I am, then I feel more in control. And again, as I said, we do want to practice. We do want to rehearse. We do want to go in as prepared as possible, but there's something going on underneath that. So when we come at it from this sort of real fear of loss of control, it really helps us to understand what's actually driving this at the deepest level. So the ego wants to control others and their reactions for us to feel safe and secure. Now, we all do this, so this is not a judgment, because every single human being does this. We learn this as children. We become very manipulative as children, and we bring it into adulthood. It's just we don't really think of it as manipulation, but it really is. And so I'm just going to start to get you to think about, how do you do this already in your day-to-day life? How are you trying to control people around you? How are you trying to manipulate people around you? I'll give you an example from my own life, because it's very sneaky. The ego is very sneaky. It knows what buttons to push for you to get you to do things to keep people around. So by control, I mean essentially trying to keep people happy, pleasing people, trying to keep people around so people don't abandon us, so people don't leave us. So an example from my own life is from a very young age, and I remember my dad saying this to me. He said I was wise beyond my years. I was very intuitive. I was very sort of connected emotionally. I would find that people would talk to me about their problems. So even, as I say, even as a child, and even my parents would share their problems with me. And people have always found it easy to talk to me. And I hear this a lot from clients. You know, once they start working with me, they feel very safe to express themselves with me. And I've always had that ever since I can remember. People have always talked to me about their problems, and they feel like they have a safe space to share. Now, I learned this very quickly, that, and I don't think it was a conscious thing at the time, but I learned that when I listen to people's problems, they stick around. So yes, on the surface, it seems very virtuous and a very kind thing to do. And certainly that was where I was going for a long time. But I realized I was also very attached to it, that this was my ego's way of stopping people leaving me. So because so many people are terrible listeners, there's not many people that will really listen to you, really hold space for you. So when you find people that do listen and do hold space for you, they are like a breath of fresh air. And I learned this very quickly. And so I started to, I don't think it was a conscious thing, as I say, but I started to sort of use this to my advantage and manipulate in a way. And I like, okay, if I listen to people's problems, they'll stick around. They'll want to be my friend. They'll want to be in a relationship with me. So I took on this persona of being the fixer, of being the counselor, of being the listener in the relationship. And as I say, it had its benefits for sure. But the negative side of that was no one ever listened to me. So it was very one-sided. All the conversations were very much about me listening to everyone else's problems. And then I might get like 5 minutes at the end of, okay, so what's going on for you, Anuska? And then they're off to do the next thing. And I found that as a repeated pattern. But I had bought into that and I was sort of very much part of the problem. So where do you, consciously or unconsciously, where have you bought into controlling people, manipulating people? On the surface, it might seem something very virtuous, but there's some other reason, there's some other attachment there. So as I say, that's a really good example from my own life. And a lot of us have this sort of badge of, you know, I'm a great listener. It could also be something like being a helper. You know, this is really common, I think, particularly for women. If I'm really helpful and I'm always doing things for people and helping them out, then they'll stick around. Now, again, I'm not saying you don't want to help people. I'm not saying you don't want to listen to people, but what's the driver for it? And this is really going to help you to understand more about public speaking anxiety, because we do want to try and control people. We all do. And it just looks different in different people. So sometimes it's pleasing and helping and listening. It could also be at the very extreme other end. It could be more aggressive and abusive way of controlling, but we all control. We all want to try and manipulate to keep people around. And I think it's really important that we really acknowledge that part of ourselves, because that is really what's driving them, this anxiety. Another way you can see this is, are you always waiting for other people to change? So I will only feel good, happy, okay, secure when you've changed, when you've done the work, when you've stopped being mean, nasty, selfish. And it's really always pointing to us. So you can see how the ego is really driving us in many ways. So one, in terms of trying to keep people around by controlling people in what appears to be a very virtuous way. And the other way is also projecting a lot of stuff onto other people. When they change, then I will be happy. So what's this got to do with public speaking? Well, this need to control and manipulate is actually what's driving your public speaking anxiety. And the more you have this desire to control and manipulate other people, whether it's conscious or not, and again, this is no judgment, we all do it. It's just acknowledging it and owning it. The more you're going to struggle with public speaking anxiety. Because at the root of public speaking anxiety is this need to try and control how people respond to us. And so, as I say, we can see it in a very small way in our day-to-day life, on a couple of people in our life, our partner, our family, our friends, and that could be on a one-on-one level. You imagine then if you're in front of 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 100,000 people, how hard that's going to be and how incredibly terrifying that is going to be, because you have got no way of controlling 2 people, let alone 10,000 people. So what makes anxiety worse? And again, coming back to this idea of it's the control element that's driving all of this. So first of all, if we can see our audience, it's always worse. And I have had many examples of this over the years. I think online meetings, podcasts, webinars have made it a lot easier, because a lot of the time you can just have the presenter view showing up. You don't even have to see half the people that are watching the webinar or the meeting, and you can just speak and then pop back into the meeting. And it's almost like you're just talking to yourself. So I have found that when I can see my audience, whether it's 2 people, 10 people, 1,000 people, 25,000 people, that is when the fear has really magnified. Because now I can see how people are responding. Do they look like they're enjoying themselves? Do they look bored? Do they look distracted? Are they getting up and leaving? You know, and that is all going to impact our anxiety. Our anxiety is going to increase. So I don't think it's got necessarily to do with the amount of people in the audience. I think it's more to do with, can we see them? So just to give you a couple of examples of this, I mean, I've had it both sides of the coin. So I've been singing most of my life. I've sung in all sorts of different theatres and concert halls and outdoor events. So I have sung in many theatres over the years. Of course, in a theatre, you're on a stage and you usually have the lights sort of shining really brightly into your face. So you literally can't see anything. I mean, if you're lucky, you can see maybe a couple of people on the front row, but most of the time you literally can't see anything. And I found that incredibly comforting because as soon as I got over the pre-nerves of the show and I was on stage and I had the lights on me and the music started, I would just get into the zone and get into the flow and I'd be fine. Didn't matter how many people were in the audience. And sometimes there could have been hundreds of people in the audience. It really didn't matter because I couldn't see them. Now, conversely, I sang at an outdoor carols by candlelight concert when I lived in Melbourne, Australia. So it was Christmas, so it was the height of summer. And I remember going out on stage. There were 25,000 people at least in the audience. It was as far as the eye could see. And I literally thought I was going to pass out. I remember going on stage. This was about, God, 7 years ago. I remember going out on stage, and this was, I should say, pre me really doing a lot of this inner work. And I literally was having this out of body experience. And I was like, how am I going to get through this? And not only was it like a huge audience, and I could see like easily, like they were like, it was like daytime almost. I could see like the first few rows as clear as day because they were sort of right there. But also, this was just like a vast stage. And it was like a massive stage with like screens either side. So the people at the back of the space could see the stage. They had cameras like zooming in on my face. There was like auto cues. And to make it kind of more terrifying for me, I was singing with a live band, and it was a big band. It was like 40 people in this band. And if anyone's ever sort of sung with a band before, most of the time when you sing with a band as the singer, you're sort of driving the song. But when you're singing with like an orchestra or a big band and there's a conductor, and there was a conductor for this, I have to be one of the instruments in the orchestra or in the band, and I can't drive the song. And that also brought so much fear for me because if I lost my place in the song, I had to find my spot again. Whereas normally when I've sung with smaller sort of setups, if I forget to come in or I lose my spot, the band will just find me. Particularly a good band, like professional musicians will find you very quickly, but they've got the flexibility to move because it's a small band. When you've got 40, 50, 60 people in an orchestra or a big band, they can't. It's like turning the Titanic. It's just too difficult. So it would be up to me to find that. So all of this, when you think about the band and the size of the stage and the audience and the cameras and the auto cue and all of this stuff, I had this moment of, I literally like panicked. Now, fortunately, although I hadn't really started this Jungian psychology individuation process at this point, I had started to awaken myself to there was something more around performance anxiety. And luckily for me, because I'd already done some shows that year, I had also started working with an amazing performance coach who really, really helped me to ground myself in those moments of panic. And that really, really helped me. So that was a very long-winded way of saying that it's really got nothing to do with the size of the audience. Had I not been able to see anyone, had it just been like twinkly lights in the background and maybe I could only see the front row, it wouldn't have bothered me. It was the fact that I could see everyone. As far as the eye could see, there was this huge audience, by far the biggest audience I'd ever sung in front of. As I say, I think they said around 25,000 people estimated. It could have been more like 30,000, but it was terrifying at the time. So I get it. I know what it's like. But then I've also done events and things, speaking events, like some of my first speaking events. There might have been like 100 people in the audience, but I could see all of their faces. And I remember again feeling like I was going to pass out because I was like, what is going on? And again, when you're going to these events as the expert voice coach, it's like I didn't want to look like I couldn't function. So all of this fear, but I think, as I said, at this point, when I started a lot of this bigger performing stuff, I'd started on this journey of performance coaching. So it really, really helped me. But now I have a whole new perspective than I did back then. Now, having said that the audience size doesn't matter, I also think it does matter if you can see them. So if you've got an audience of 2 people and you can see them, you might feel a little bit anxious, maybe if one of them's your boss or one of them's someone that you perceive to be important to you. But I do think that if you can see the audience, then the bigger the audience, the more terrifying it is. Again, coming back to the control thing, the more people there are, the more people we feel we've got to try and control in some way. And the ego just doesn't, it's not possible. The ego just almost gives up. It's like, well, I can't do it. So what am I going to do? I'm just going to have a panic attack. I'm just going to like shut down. Or in my case, I'm just going to have an out of body experience because I don't know what to do because I can't control 25,000 people. I can barely control one person. I've sort of alluded to this already, but also when we are doing any kind of performance in person, it's always more vulnerable. I sort of said about as the presenter, when you're online, you can often just have the presenter view and hide all the audience. So you can basically talk to yourself. But also, again, when we're talking online, a lot of the time people turn their cameras off, or you can just see a head. Also, people often use weird usernames like numbers and random letters. So you don't even really know who you're talking to, particularly if you're doing like live streams on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook, so you don't often know who you're talking to. But I think in person, it's far more vulnerable because you're feeling the energy of the room. You can see people. You can see if someone stands up and walks out or is yawning or on their phone, or you just notice that stuff far more. And you feel more vulnerable because you're in that space. And then also at the start, I did talk about some of the common advice is around practicing and rehearsing. So yes, of course, if you don't practice, again, coming back to the control, you are going to feel more anxious. If you've got no idea what you're going to do, you haven't prepared, you don't know what you're going to talk about, yes, you're probably going to feel more anxious because you are more out of control. Another one I would add here from my perspective is when people haven't had any voice training and they have a very unreliable, unstable voice, you're also going to feel more anxious because, again, it's another reason to feel out of control. So whether you're a singer, whether you're a speaker, you want to really master your voice because then that eliminates one of those strands of fear, strands of feeling out of control, because you're like, okay, whatever happens, I know how to get my voice out. I know how to effortlessly power my voice, how to speak with clarity, to project without straining, without pushing, without yelling, without going too breathy or nasal or raspy. So you can get the voice out. And you do need to be trained. And again, I think a lot of the anxiety for singers often is that they're just not trained when they are trying to sing stuff that perhaps is outside of their comfort zone in terms of range or dynamics, and you haven't got the technique, you haven't got the training. You almost want the voice training to be so embodied. So regardless of what happens, so even if there's an issue with lighting or a piece of set falls down behind you or an alarm goes off, I mean, I've had all of this. It doesn't impact your ability to deliver because it's almost like your body just takes over. Your voice just takes over because it's so embodied that your voice just almost takes on a mind of its own. And certainly I found that particularly with singing, that the technique is so ingrained and so embodied that I can be really anxious and it doesn't really impact my voice. So really what we're saying is, from this perspective, the more out of control you feel, the more anxious you feel. But we're coming from the illusion that we have any control in the first place, that we can control. And that's why we really struggle with this when we have a bigger audience or we can see people and we're so used to controlling people in our day-to-day life. And now we're like, oh my God, I can't control this group of people. I can't control whether people like me, whether they're going to listen, whether they're going to be interested. And it feels so terrifying. If you come from this ego way of thinking, it really is a lose-lose because you can only control so much. You can practice, you can prepare, you can go to the venue and have a sound check. You can do all of those things, but there's so much out of your control, namely the audience and what they're going to do and how many of them are there. And is anyone going to ask you any difficult questions? And are people going to get upset and walk out? All of that stuff is all feeding into our fear. So it's really this feeling of being powerless that drives this fear. And only the ego feels powerless. Only the ego feels fear. Only the ego feels out of control. So part of this work, and again, this is not going to happen overnight. It is a process, is loosening this attachment to our ego being who we are. And this is the deeper work. This is the piece beyond the just practice, just rehearse, and then everything will be great. Yes, but you're still buying into the illusion that you can control. So really, when you learn to connect to this higher, sort of truer part of yourself, then that almost takes over. And that is what I have found, that yes, you do the practice, yes, you do the preparation, yes, you rehearse, you train your voice, you do all that. Even if stuff happens, something kind of almost beyond this small self takes over, and you just find, wow, my voice came out, or I just remembered everything. But when we're in ego, we are the small self, we're the powerless self, we're the limited self, the fearful self, and we can never access this powerful part of ourself from this powerless part of ourself. Also, from this perspective, the audience is literally just a mirror of you. The more grounded and connected and confident you feel within, the more that will be reflected out to you with your audience. And I've seen this so many times myself. When I felt really insecure, really lacking confidence, really not quite sure what I'm doing, I would feel I would get like a lackluster response from the audience or not much response. When I started to do this deeper work and I started to connect more deeply with myself, and I would show up in a different energy and I was more present with myself, then that would be reflected in the audience. And it was just so interesting. Whereas from ego, we feel we've got to manipulate and control people. But it is a lose-lose. It's a battle you'll never win. And yes, you can to some extent control people, but you really can't. It's an illusion. We can't control people. The only person we have any control over is ourselves and how we show up and what we bring to the table and how we interpret situations. So how can you begin then to connect to this deeper self, this true self, this is a big part of my private coaching, which again is why I generally work with people for 8 months, because it's not something that happens overnight. This is a journey, but even after the 8 months, it's never over. It's never sort of done. I mean, it's still an ongoing journey for me, but you have enough knowledge and enough awareness now to kind of run with it yourself. Versus when you start, it's quite challenging to go from this sort of almost ego consciousness to this higher level of consciousness without any sort of support to kind of navigate the bridge between the two. So when we can connect to this higher part of ourselves, this is where true peace and true confidence comes from, meaning it's not attached to a specific person, a specific outcome, a specific circumstance. And so from the ego perspective, our happiness is very much dependent on, as I said, how other people react to us, whether they like us, whether they accept us. And so therefore we have to control people. We have to try and manipulate people to get them to do or say what we want. From this perspective, we bring the power back to us, that I am the source of everything in my life and the world is just a mirror. So that brings me to point one. It's really about you becoming very, very aware of yourself, knowing yourself on a very deep level. And this is where shadow work is incredibly powerful, because shadow work is really this integration of the whole self. So the parts of yourself that you have repressed, that you've denied, that you've avoided, that you've run away from, it's really integrating it all. So you become a whole person. And then when you show up, you are less triggered, you are less anxious because you really understand that everything I'm seeing is a part of my own mind. The more triggered I am, the more it's a part of me. Now, the ego doesn't like this. The ego wants you to think that people are doing things to you and you can be a victim and you can blame and you can judge. But the power really comes from when you really bring that projection back and really own that everything you're seeing is a part of your own mind, particularly when it triggers you. So this is a very empowering place to be then when you are public speaking. So it doesn't really matter then what people do because it's an opportunity for growth and learning. And the more you understand yourself, the less triggered you will be. And therefore, you're going to show up differently. The less anxious you're going to feel, the more confident you're going to feel, because nothing can really phase you anymore. It doesn't really matter what people do out there. It's only your perception of that situation that has any sort of control over you. So the next one then is connect to your joy or follow your bliss, as Joseph Campbell said. Really powerful because actually when you do this, this is the immediate connection to this true self. Now, this could be anything. There's no right or wrong. You know, it could be being in nature. It could be singing. It could be playing the piano. It could be cooking, gardening, playing with your dog, going for a swim. It could be anything, but something where you feel this expansion, you feel your kind of heart opening. That is where you want to spend more time because that's connecting you more and more to the truth of who you are. So try and do as much as you can, and particularly if you can bring that into your career and your business. But even if you can't at the moment, try and bring as much of that into your day-to-day life as possible and try and live in that space as much as possible, because this is how we begin to connect to this true self. So we have to do the shadow work. We have to integrate these disconnected parts of ourselves, but we also have to then go towards this higher, more expansive part of ourselves. And one way we do that is to follow this intuition, this creativity, this joy, this bliss. Now, some other practical things you can do: meditation, really, really powerful, visualization. I usually get all my clients to do some kind of meditation visualization practice, particularly before you go and do any kind of public speaking. Like, really visualize yourself standing on that stage or being in that meeting room, and really visualize everything, like how you want your voice to sound, how you want to feel, what you'd be wearing, how people will respond to you. Like, really play it in your mind, play it as a movie in your mind. And the mind doesn't know the difference between what we imagine and our so-called 3D reality. So the more you can do this, the more you will find then when you are in those situations, the mind's like, oh, well, I've been here before, so it's safe. And then it's more accepting of these situations. So I would do that a lot with singing on stages, particularly if it was a bigger performance. Because I would usually have done some kind of rehearsal or something at the venue, and I would really see myself on stage and I would know what I'm going to wear and I would hear myself singing. And then finally, breathing, which of course you want for speech anyway, or singing. We want a deeper, slower, silent breath when we're using our voice. But it's also a very, very quick way of presencing ourselves, of grounding ourselves. And as I said earlier on about my experience, one of the things that my performance coach got me to do was some quick centered breathing when I was in this situation where I felt very out of control, particularly that performance I was talking about. But you can get into a practice of this. So it's a win-win-win-win-win, because the more you deepen your breath, the more you have control over your voice, coming back to control, the more it stimulates your parasympathetic nervous system, the vagus nerve. So you're automatically going to feel better, but also you're just going to feel more grounded. You're going to be in your body. And just remember that being in the present moment is really where everything lives. There is no past, there is no future. So the more you can anchor to the present, the more calm, empowered, and clear you'll be able to think. So I hope this has helped. And again, as I said, this is part of my private coaching. This is, we work with the anxiety, we work with the triggers, we work with all the stuff that's showing up for you when you do speak, because we start to look at the shadow in this and what are you really pushing away? What are you really afraid of? And that is a really, really important part of this. It's not just about practicing, because you're then just avoiding, you're still avoiding the shadow part of yourself. So you've got to integrate it, you've got to look at it, and you've got to integrate it. And then when you've integrated as much as you can, I mean, we're never going to have it perfect, then you move into this bigger vision. Then you can really start to connect to this true part of yourself. And the meditation and the visualization becomes so much more powerful. So if you're interested in this deep transformational program, Speak with Impact, the links are below. You can book a 15-minute consult, or you can book a 60-minute private coaching session if you want to actually see how I would work with you. But this is powerful work. This is transformational work beyond the voice. You show up differently. And as one client said to me a couple of years ago, she said, I just feel like I've got this understated confidence. And that's it in a nutshell. This isn't ego confidence. This is true confidence. This is groundedness. This is presence. This is feeling really anchored and secure in your body, regardless of what's going on externally. And that's where the true power lives. So thank you so much. And I will see you next week.